Thanksgiving weekend, 1992. A mother drives home through the quiet suburbs of Atlanta with her two young sons asleep in the back seat. It's late. They've just returned from visiting family in Florida, but as they pull into their driveway, something or someone is already waiting. Within minutes, she's dead. Shot in the head, her children still in the car, witnessing everything. The crime shocked the city, it rattled investigators, and for the woman's family, it raised a question that would haunt them for decades. How could something so brutal happen to someone so loved? Her name was Sara Tokars. She was a mother, a sister, a daughter, and by all outward appearances, she had built the kind of life most people dream of. A successful husband, beautiful children, and a home in one of Atlanta's wealthiest suburbs. But what looked like a dream was hiding something far darker. This is the story of Sara Tokars. And to learn everything Sara did that ultimately got her killed, we have to go behind the headlines. Sara and Brusco grew up in the suburbs of Buffalo, New York, with loving parents and a whole slew of sisters. She was attractive and peppy, and was a talented cheerleader for her high school. But soon after Sara graduated, the family grew tired of the blistering New York winters and made the move down south, landing in Bradenton, Florida, which is just outside of Tampa. While living in Florida for quite some time and working as an elementary school teacher, Sara met a reclusive and wealthy Atlanta health club owner in 1981 on the beach. They fell fast for each other and quickly got married, relocating Sara to Atlanta. This health club was high status. It catered to players of the Atlanta Falcons, investors, and beautiful women. While Sara was exceedingly gorgeous, her husband couldn't manage to keep his hands to himself when it came to his patrons. So their marriage ended shortly after Sara had moved to Atlanta. Amid heartbreak, Sara's sister Chrissy moved to Atlanta to be with her, and they shared a small Atlanta apartment. Now on her own, Sara ditched the teaching and began working in the Atlanta nightclub scene, which was extremely lucrative in the 1980s. She was a promoter for a Northside club called Elan, which funnily enough was one of Fred Tokars' favorite local haunts. However, Fred and Sara didn't meet organically. While he was a patron at the nightclub where she worked, one morning, while Sara snuggled on the couch with a cup of coffee, watching the news, she noticed him. He was gangly with sharp features, noticeable, and notice him she did. She had grown up with this man who's on her local news channel, nearly 900 miles away from their hometown. Fred Tokars grew up alongside Sara. They went to high school together and were raised in the same neighborhood in Buffalo. Sara found comfort in seeing someone from up north in this southern city, and she impulsively decided to look him up and call him, and they went on several dates. Sara said that Fred brought back pleasant memories of her childhood. Her father, John Brusco, was a doctor, and she felt safe knowing that Fred had a good career like her dad and could depend on him. Ironically, Fred was on the news because he was serving as a junior prosecutor on a murder case. The case was the murder of an attorney that had been committed by his lover. Perhaps Fred found this symbolic and gave it some thought before he had a hit hired on his own wife. Fred Tokars was often referred to as Fast Fred by his colleagues. This nickname came from his constant self-promotion and involvement in the Atlanta nightlife scene. He was fast when it came to his and Sara's relationship too. In 1985, Sara and Fred officially tied the knot while they were both 32 years old. Sara continued promoting the nightclub Elan, and Fred had opened up his own law practice, switching from prosecuting to defending. She also enjoyed that he would come home and indulge Sara and her sister Chrissy in all the stories of the people he would defend during his workday. The girl said it was invigorating. I imagine similar to listening to true crime today. They were informed but far enough away from the crimes to be safe. A year later, Sara gave birth to her and Fred's first son, Ricky, in September of 1986. Having a newfound love for motherhood, Sara wanted to quit her job and stay home to take care of the baby, but Fred would not allow this to happen. Sara was heartbroken by the fact that Fred wouldn't let her quit her job to be home with Ricky, but she had already had one, marriage fell, and didn't want to happen again, so she obliged. She spent half the day working at the nightclub and the other half of the long day taking care of Ricky. The only problem was that the 1980s were detrimental to the club scene. Drinking and driving laws became more strict and more firmly enforced. 2-for-1 happy hours were outlawed, and the seriousness of the AIDS epidemic was rising. Subsequently, the nightclub Sara worked at, Elan, ended up letting her go, and albeit in a less decisive way, she became a stay-at-home mom. Even though Fred and Sara kept a quiet picket fence facade, behind closed doors, Sara felt like something was off, but she wanted their family to grow. She hated the idea of Ricky being an only child, so in 1988, Michael was brought into a world that would forever scar him. When Sara lost her job and had no stream of income for herself, Fred began to give her a very strict allowance of $400 cash so she couldn't go over it. Sara also confided in her sisters a lot about how she felt in their relationship. She said he had a dark side and was rarely home. She was concerned about how little time he was spending with his sons. She suspected that he had been having affairs and not being truthful about his whereabouts because most nights he would call home to say he'd be getting in late, and Sara could hear chatter and music in the background of the call, like he was in a bar or a restaurant. Sara still wanted the best for Ricky and Michael, so she considered divorce, but ultimately decided against it because she didn't want to lose her kids. She said that was a probable outcome of divorce because Fred had so many high-profile connections in the district attorney's office. Even the Ambrusco family began to notice things were changing between her and Fred. They said he lacked attentiveness, and Sara's father, John Ambrusco, said he hardly ever had dinner at home. He was always working late at night. Sara used to be discouraged about the fact that he was never home. Fred also had a strong aversion to letting Sara and the boys go down to Florida to visit Sara's family. He didn't ever want to go with her. And on the rare occasion he would travel to see Sara's family, he would take a first-class flight while Sara, Ricky, and Michael had to drive the 9 hours down. He also wouldn't stray from his budget, so he wouldn't give her any money for gas, food, or hotels. Sara also wasn't allowed to have any credit or checking accounts, so there was nothing to fall back on if her small allowance of $400 had been spent. Sara began to realize that this was unhealthy, toxic, and all too much. So she contacted an attorney who advised her to hire a private investigator in order to determine if Fred had been unfaithful to her. Unfortunately, the PI quickly found out that Sara's suspicions were true, but when Sara confronted Fred, he dismissed her feelings, claiming the affair to be meaningless. Sara knew this was far from meaningless, and she began to get fed up. She began acting out, slightly sneakily. She began to open credit cards in her name to have a little more financial freedom, but because her allowance was so small, she struggled to keep up with the monthly payments. She was financially sinking while Fred was soaring. Then, Sara got a little sneakier. She began rummaging through their basement. Sara knew Fred was in some sticky business with some bad people. He often represented drug dealers, money launderers, and assisted in divorces. He was also helping these drug dealers launder money in the nightclubs he frequented. In 1990, Tokars wrote in the Atlanta Business Chronicle, "These money laundering and cash transaction requirement laws became so complex, drug dealers ultimately needed to hire attorneys to explain how to circumvent this new system. For the most part, these professional services are no different than those rendered to legitimate clients. In fact, attorneys often launder money without knowing it." Pretty ironic looking back, and it really proves that Fred Tokars was never a good guy. Sara, of course, found tons of incriminating evidence in her own basement. She made copies of his financial documents, where she found accounts that Fred had opened in the Bahamas. He was using pseudonyms and depositing absurd amounts of money, all while Sara was struggling to keep food in Ricky and Michael's mouths. She made copies of anything and everything she could find, and stashed them at her sister's house for safekeeping, but she was never really safe. Eventually, Fred found out what she was doing, and he fell off the handle. Hard. He became physically abusive to Sara. There was one instance where an attorney buddy of Fred's had invited the couple to a party he was throwing. Sara called the attorney at his office and said, "I feel so bad that we're not able to come to your party. I'm not well." The attorney expressed his disappointment, but then Sara whispered into the receiver, "I can't come because I have bruises on my left arm where Fred beat me." She paused then, frantic. "You wouldn't say anything about this, would you? Please don't say anything about this. Don't even tell Fred I called." Sara grew more and more scared for her fate after Fred found out she had been collecting evidence against him. Only a few weeks before Thanksgiving, Sara called her sister and told her that she had found a way to divorce Fred and keep custody of Ricky and Michael. She wouldn't elaborate over the phone, but told her sister that she'd tell her when she saw her. Only, she wouldn't see her again. It seemed as though Sara may have had a strong gut feeling that something was really wrong. The personal investigator she had hired said that Sara made him promise that if anything were to happen to her, that he should go straight to the police with everything they had. If only Sara hadn't seen Fred on the news that morning 8 years prior and called him on a whim, she may very well still be alive. Thanksgiving Day on November 29th, 1992, a 39-year-old Sara was hauling 6-year-old Ricky and 4-year-old Michael back to Atlanta after spending Thanksgiving with their family in Florida. Fred had left the holiday celebration a day early to tend to business in Montgomery, Alabama. Just as Sara and the kids were pulling out of her family's neighborhood, John Ambrusco's phone rang. He answered and was asked by Fred if Sara and the boys had left his house yet. He replied that she literally just pulled away. Just before 10 p.m., Sara pulled into her garage. Michael was asleep in the back seat, and desperate not to disturb him, Sara quietly began unpacking with Ricky and bringing their things inside. But something was off. Their dog, Jake, was barking like crazy at something, and then Sara saw him. A man was standing in her home with a sawed-off shotgun pointed right at her. The man kicked Jake and then forced Sara and Ricky back into the car and demanded that she drive. All Sara could muster in this moment of panic was, "Just don't hurt me and my kids." She began to drive, then offered the intruder her purse, thinking he was just trying to rob them. She begged him to leave. She said he could have the car, have her purse, have everything, but to just leave her and her boys be. The intruder wasn't pleased and simply wanted her to keep driving. Obviously, Michael has now been awoken. Those poor boys were petrified in the back seat. They got a little way through the neighborhood, and the attacker told Sara to make a right turn, but Sara knew it was a dead end and pulled over. The attacker said to her, "Don't be fucking with me." And Sara, desperate to protect her children, said, "I'm not fucking with you. I can't turn here." Unfortunately, that was seemingly the wrong answer for the attacker. He point blank shot her in the back of the head with the shotgun, right in front of Ricky and Michael. The man then bolted, and the car with Sara slumped over the steering wheel began to coast into an open field until it rolled to a stop. Ricky then reached across his mom's body and turned the key in the ignition to bring the engine to a complete stop. He said he had been taught to never leave a car running by Sara, and this stuck with him in that moment. Then, Ricky grabs Michael's little hand and they began walking. They walked until they found a house with lights on, traumatized but desperate not to disturb sleeping neighbors, and told the kind people who answered the door that their mommy had been hurt. An ambulance and police were immediately called at the sight of little Ricky and Michael. They were covered in their innocent mom's blood splatter, and Mike had thrown up all day on the front of his shirt. The police pronounced Sara to be dead at the scene, and the police called Fred, who was spending the night in Alabama on business, to inform him and make arrangements for Ricky and Mike. The police then contacted Sara's family, and Fred's illicit dealings with untrustworthy men would be his downfall. Only a man with insides as rotten as his could hire a hit on his wife to have her head blown off in front of his 2 pre-K aged sons. The day after Sara Tokars was murdered, investigators from Cobb County searched the Tokars' home. It had all the signs of a robbery, at least on the surface, but something didn't sit right. Ron Hunton, a lead detective on the case, recalled his first impression. "My first impression was that the scene had been staged to make it look like a burglary when it was not a burglary. The fact that the man had broken in pointed to a robbery, but nothing of value was taken. The alarm had been disabled, as if the intruder knew the code. Entry was made through a sliding glass door with a broken lock, raising the question of how the intruder even knew to try that door. How would he know that the lock had been broken? A lot of questions were unanswered, but one thing was for sure. Sara Tokars had been murdered, and it wasn't over a purse.
This isn't a holdup, nothing was stolen. I said, this is an execution. Somebody had that girl killed, and we gotta find out who did that and why.
A few agonizing days later, Sara's parent and sisters gathered at a hotel in Atlanta, devastated, looking for answers and trying to assist in the investigation in any way they could. One person was noticeably absent from the conversation: Fred Tokars, Sara's husband. He actively avoided and refused to speak to the police and showed little interest in participating in the family's grieving.
I'd never seen anybody act like him before. He was just more anxious than sad. He never talked about Sara. He never said, "Oh my God, poor Sara. Oh, what she went through. Poor Rick and Mike." He was just all acting like, "I'm scared. I gotta get out of Dodge," he kept saying.
At Sara's funeral on December 3rd, Fred still refused to speak to law enforcement. This obviously raised red flags for the police. What was he hiding? The family, especially Sara's sister Gretchen Schaefer, found his behavior extremely strange, and something wasn't helping Fred's case in the slightest. He didn't seem to be distraught by the fact that his wife had been murdered in front of his 2 kids. Gretchen confronted him, and Fred offered the sorry explanation of, "I hope you understand," he told her. "The reason I can't go to the police is because I've taken a lot of money from shady clients and not paid taxes on it. I'm afraid if they look into my business dealings, they'll accuse me of tax evasion," which, even if this travesty hadn't been committed against Sara, Fred's illicit dealings would eventually come to light. That confession to Gretchen redirected the investigation. Detectives began to consider that Sara might have been killed because of Fred's connections and wrongdoings, not because she was a random target, but because she was a threat to revealing the kind of work that Fred really conducted. Fred finally agreed to speak with police on December 6th, 1992.
Idea who may have wanted to kill Sara. Just can't even imagine it.
But the interview raised more red flags. He couldn't recall basic details and offered very little useful information. What he did reveal was startling, and even if he didn't realize it at the time, it gave him a second motive for having Sara killed. Sara had multiple life insurance policies, and he stood to collect $1.75 million from her death. The first motive was the dirt she had collected on him for all his money laundering and tax evasion.
What kind of insurance policies did you have with Sara then?
Sara and I have the same type of insurance policies. One of them is for $250,000. One of them is for $1 million, and I think that there's another one for $500,000.
While Fred claimed they had a good marriage, police were hearing a different story from all of Sara's family. The children said their parents didn't even sleep in the same bed at night. Sara was upset with and disagreed with Fred's business practices, his erratic hours, and his schmarmy friends. So with all their new information and Fred's evasion of law enforcement, coupled with his lying about their relationship, he quickly became the prime suspect in the murder of Sara Tokars, formerly Ambrusco. The Ambrusco family, desperate for justice, went public with their plea, begging anyone with any hints of information to come forward, and people did. Then came the break in the case, a series of tips that led police to Curtis Rower, a 22-year-old drug user and small-time dealer. He had allegedly been bragging to friends that he had killed Sara Tokars. He considered it an accomplishment. He likely thought this would propel him higher into the world of crime he had been trying to get into, but he simply wasn't cut out for that role. Rower immediately folded under pressure and confessed. He said he'd been hired for $5,000 by a man named Eddie Lawrence, a 28-year-old businessman. Lawrence had previously been Fred's client in a counterfeiting case, and Fred had since gotten involved in all his business dealings, including a construction company that had very little information about it. It's presumed this business was created just to hold all of Lawrence and Tokars' money. The police found it very intriguing that Fred had never mentioned his partnership and involvement with Eddie Lawrence during his interviews, but when investigators confronted him directly, Fred didn't see why it would be necessary to mention Lawrence.
This name was never mentioned.
Well, I'm not sure if I understand what you're talking about.
You never told me anything about Eddie Lawrence.
Well, you never asked me anything about it.
He implied that they were simply business partners in the construction company, but the police didn't fully buy this. Lawrence had been in sticky situations with the law on multitude of occasions and had a reputation for being pretty slimy in the Atlanta business and crime world. Even though Fred had been the prime suspect for quite some time, on December 23, 1992, he was publicly named a suspect. That same exact day, both Eddie Lawrence and Curtis Rower were charged with Sara's murder. Investigators also announced that Fred was under investigation for drug trafficking and money laundering. This is when it all hit the fan. Rower had no doubt been caught as the intruder who shot Sara that horrendous night, with Eddie Lawrence on the hook for hiring Rower to do so, and Fred was already in deep trouble for his white-collar crimes, and it would only get worse once the truth about Sara's murder came out. According to Rower, the night of the murder went like this. He spotted Lawrence parked on a nearby street. When Sara and her 2 sons arrived, Lawrence walked up to the car. Rower later said she acted like she knew Eddie, like she was in shock. Chillingly, Lawrence had allegedly reassured Rower before the hit, "Don't touch the kids. Don't do nothing to the kids." In the most heart-wrenching manner, Just before Rower shot Sara in the head, little 4-year-old Mike tugged on Rower's sleeve before he pulled the trigger, almost as if he was silently pleading. That Christmas, 2 days after Fred had been announced as the prime suspect, Fred and his sons were in Florida with Sara's family. He relentlessly urged them not to speak with police or the press. On Christmas Eve, Fred checked into a hotel in Florida as he was unwelcome to stay with the Ambruscos and overdosed on sleeping pills. He left a note claiming his innocence. "I loved Sara. I never hurt her, and I have now died for her." But Fred survived his attempted suicide. A family member had become worried and called the hotel, subsequently saving his life.
Fred's suicide attempt showed two things. One, that he was involved and that he was guilty and he knew that they were closing in on him. And two, that we had to just be so careful with the boys because we felt that the boys were not safe with Fred.
Days later, Fred held a press conference. He defended himself and bizarrely focused on his lifestyle and wealth details that only made him look guiltier.
"I emphatically deny any involvement in my wife's murder, and any suggestion that I might have been involved in any way deeply hurts me. Unfortunately, after drinking too much and after taking some back pain medication, I became very depressed and started to think of the lifestyle that I was losing. Not only my wife, but my whole lifestyle."
Sara's sister agreed that his worries were all in the wrong place. Police knew they needed a stronger link between Fred and the killer. That link came in August 1993 when Eddie Lawrence accepted a plea deal. Lawrence avoided the death penalty in exchange for life in prison and agreed to testify against Fred, not only in Sara's murder, but also in a sweeping drug, money laundering, and cocaine smuggling case. That same month, Fred Tokars was arrested in April 1994 after his federal trial. Fred was convicted of all charges, including using interstate phone lines to plan his wife's murder. He received 4 life sentences without parole. Still, the most damning trial was yet to come. The aforementioned trial was simply for the white-collar crimes, and Lawrence still planned to testify against Fred in the case in which he is accused of hiring a hit on Sara. The story of Fred and Sara seems to be right out of a blockbuster movie, and Hollywood elites thought so too. Blinded by the lights, detectives Ron Hunton and Pat Banks had actually signed away the rights to Sara's case before justice had even been secured for her. Banks admitted to making a mistake in selling vital case information, but assured others that it didn't interfere with the case. They were both fired anyway.
I never in my life have seen the 2 primary investigators on a murder case signing a movie deal and getting money in the midst of the investigation. It's insanity.
Even though Hollywood had the rights to Sara's story, the case was still open. In January 1997, the murder trial of Fred Tokars began in North Georgia. Due to overwhelming media attention, the judge moved it to a different county, but that did little to stop the attention the case was getting. Prosecutors argued that Fred, drawn in by the easy money of the drug world, had become desperate. Sara was a liability, and the insurance payout was too tempting to ignore. All in all, Fred had thrown his life away. A beautiful wife, 2 little boys, and what appeared to be the white picket fence dream for money. Eddie Lawrence testified that Fred offered him $25,000 for arranging the murder. Lawrence, already in debt to Fred, was threatened. Cooperate or Fred would shut down their shared business. So Lawrence did, and he hired Rower. Lawrence described a Sunday meeting at Fred's office where they reviewed the plan, but the defense attacked his credibility. The building was locked on Sundays, the elevator required a key, and the name Eddie used to sign in belonged to someone else in the building. Why Lawrence felt the need to lie about this is confusing, but it also leaves you wondering if someone else who worked in Fred's building was in on the hit. And it was never really Lawrence in the building to begin with. The defense argued that Eddie acted alone, trying to send a message to Fred over money owed. They argued that he wasn't a reliable witness due to his past encounters with the law.
If he was Pinocchio, they'd have to drive a wagon truck in here with his nose on it.
And he's a liar, and he's a cheat, and he's a scoundrel.
But Eddie knew details he couldn't have known unless Fred had told him, like when Sara would be home from Florida, the alarm, the passcode, and which door had a broken lock. He also had specific dates, times, and details that he could have only received from Fred, making it clear that Lawrence was simply Fred's puppet. Witnesses backed up Eddie's version of events. Fred's mistress testified he had openly talked about hiring Lawrence to kill Sara.
When Fred talked about taking care of Sara, Did Fred say anything about who might do it?
Eddie Lawrence.
And did Fred say anything about why he was choosing Eddie Lawrence?
Because he owed him money.
A prostitute that Fred had hired to have sex with him in a limo for $100 said he asked if she knew a drug dealer who could kill his wife.
Is it because your wife's not satisfying you in bed or something? And he said no, it was because she was divorcing him and she knew too much and he had too much to lose.
She thought he was joking, but he wasn't. Sara's family recalled Fred's odd behavior, both before and after the murder. One cousin testified that Sara had expressed fear shortly before her death, believing she knew too much.
You asked Sara, "Are you safe?"
Yes.
And what was her reply?
She said, "Oh, Mayor, you worry too much."
Next time you heard about Sara Tokars, was she dead?
She was dead.
Fred's defense found the confessions of the Ambrusco family to be lackluster. He argued that Sara had everything she could ever want or need, and that they were simply trying to paint Fred in the worst light possible. Even Fred's son, Ricky, just 8 years old at the time, gave testimony. In the earlier trial of Curtis Rower, his recorded statement was played. He saw the man shoot his mother in the head.
Turn here, and my mom goes, "Is it okay if I just drop you off here because I'm in shock. I'm so scared."
What did the man say?
"Don't try to with me.
And what did your mom say?
I'm not trying to with you."
The district attorney wanted no chance of Fred getting away with this. He addressed the jury.
And all she cares about is the protection of her children. Only to have her brains blown out over those two little boys. Because of the mastermind over here. Because of the greed, the unparalleled ambition, and because she just simply was in the way.
Former Assistant U.S. Attorney Buddy Parker recalled the trial. He says, "I called Tokars evil in my closing argument, and he was. I don't think there's any way you can think otherwise. Having the mother of your sons killed in front of them." After nearly 13 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty. But they spared Fred from the death penalty. Two jurors, both retired medical professionals, swayed the others toward life in prison and not death.
Well, after 30-something years in the medical field trying to save life and preserve it, it would be hard for me to say.
Fred cried in court, whispering to his mother, "I'm okay, I love you." Sara's family was devastated. They believed justice had fallen short.
Fred knew that Sara and Rick and Mike were going to walk into that house that night. He knew that Rick and Mike were going to be there. And we can't understand how anyone can plan the murder of a young mother like that and be spared. Who was there to spare Sara? No one was there to show Sara any mercy.
Fred Tokars was incarcerated in Atlanta and lost all contact with his sons. The $1.75 million insurance payout was redirected into a trust for the boys who were raised by Sara's parents in Florida and tried to have some semblance of a normal childhood, but that's something that lives in your brain forever. Even though Fred was spared the death penalty, during his 1997 trial, his fate in prison may have actually been much worse than the electric chair or lethal injection. He had a constant target on his back in prison. As soon as word got around that he was an attorney, inmates began to threaten and beat him up so that Fred would work on their appeals. But that wasn't the worst of his face. Throughout his time in prison, he had a ton of health issues. He was transferred to a prison in Pennsylvania for treatment. He suffered from a neurological disease that destroyed his body. He couldn't walk. He looked as if he never ate. He wore diapers, had severe anxiety, and had to relieve himself through a catheter. Eventually, during the coronavirus outbreak, Fred died at 67 of sclerosis in May 2020. One of Sara's sisters, Joni, was still not happy with this outcome. She said, "He should have died in the electric chair 28 years ago. The pain and suffering that he caused those little boys and our family was and continues to be immeasurable." While Fred's death was likely a celebration for most people, a completely shocking and devastating death occurred just a week before Fred's. Michael, the youngest son of Sara, had a pulmonary embolism and ultimately passed away due to blood clots. He was only 31 at the time. Michael and Ricky deserved so much more, but Mike and Sara are together once again. Mike's friend, Brendan Flanagan, attested to Mike's lovely personality. Mike was a beloved son, brother, nephew, uncle, and friend. He was adored by so many and impacted the lives of countless people during every stage of his abbreviated time on Earth. We loved Mike for immeasurable reasons, for his tenacious curiosity, compassionate heart, infectious sense of humor, and kindred spirit. Sara Tokars never lived to see justice. She never got the chance to hold her sons again, to tell them everything would be okay, or to escape the nightmare she had quietly endured for so long. Mere inches away from her children, murdered in a cold and calculated act of betrayal. But Sara wasn't just a victim of her husband, she was a victim of silence, of a system that couldn't protect her in time, of a man who saw her not as a partner or the mother of his children, but as a liability. Fred Tokars lost everything he pretended to care about, and yet, even as the trials dragged on, as plea deals were struck and life sentences handed down, many believed justice didn't go far enough. Sara's family was left with a verdict, but no peace. Her children were left with scars no life sentence could ever heal. For Ricky and Michael Tokars, the aftermath of that night was its own kind of life sentence. They were forced to grow up without their mother, without answers, and for much of their young lives without the truth. Michael would later pass away at just 31 years old. The weight of his trauma never left him. For Ricky, the pain and the loss still echo today. Sara's story isn't just a true crime. It's a reminder of how quickly a charming smile and polished exterior can mask something rotten underneath. It's about the price of uncovering the truth and what happens when that truth threatens powerful people. We tell stories like Sara's not to just remember the horror, but to honor the person, the woman who saw the danger, who collected the evidence, who tried everything she could to get out, and who paid the ultimate price for what she knew. So we remember Sara Tokars. We remember the bright young girl from Buffalo, the loving mother, the woman who refused to stay silent. And we remember that justice, while it can convict, doesn't always heal. This has been Joshua John with Behind the Headlines, and until next time, stay safe.